Dude, lady, this is not an easy conversation today because we're dealing with things that we kind of just have to cover factually to get through the details and to set the stage of what's going on here culturally in Esther's world in Esther chapter 4. But this topic is delicate and it's human and it brings up a whole lot of issues and a whole lot of things. So I'm just going to do my best to relay what the deal was in the ancient world with eunuchs, how that worked, what their lives were like, what we know about them, and then think a little bit about what the original audience would have assumed about eunuchs as eunuchs started to factor heavily in the story of Esther the further into it we get. That said, this is sort of a content warning. You're smart. You see what I'm doing. I know a lot of you listen to this with kids and family and everything. And I want it to be a family-friendly program. But sometimes the Bible just gets into topics that aren't totally family-friendly. So there, I've bought you a little bit of time to discreetly change what's going on and distract anyone you need to distract. And now we're going to get into it in 3, 2, 1, go. The go-between between Esther and Mordecai is the guy who's in charge of the harem. Now, Queen Esther, you could define her as being technically on the fringes of the harem, or maybe the better way to put it would be the harem would be all the concubines, but in the Persian palace, there was also a collection of wives. We know of at least 2 at this time, Amestris and Esther. And it looks like maybe the management of all of that, the wives, their attendants, the concubines, maybe that was all under the purview of one particular eunuch. In this case, the man named Hathach, who goes on behalf of Esther to talk to Mordecai, then comes back to Esther with Mordecai's message here in the middle of Esther chapter 4. There's a pretty dramatic moment here that includes this eunuch when Mordecai reveals to someone, very casually, by the way, for the first time, that Esther is a Jew. Now, this Hathach guy, the eunuch, and we're going to talk a lot more about what that means in just a second, he's going to be real socially dialed. He's going to be very discreet. He's going to be very trained in the arts of how to be attuned to the needs of a king and the ebb and flow and pulse of a royal court. He's good at gossip. He's good at knowing when to do it and not do it. He's got spies. This guy's job is to know things. But there's one thing that this eunuch master of intrigue, Hathach, doesn't know, and that is the ethnic identity of the queen who he is charged with taking care of. Look at what happens. It's really discreet between Hathach and Mordecai as they're having this conversation. Hathach goes out to Mordecai, that's verse 6, and they talk about some stuff, and Mordecai gives him all the details, including how much money Haman tried to pay to kill all of the Jews. And then he's like, hey, you got to go tell Esther this stuff. Mordecai told Hathach to urge Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him. These are the 3 words that would have initiated the da-da-da. Get the close-up shot of Hathach's shocked face reveal moment. Go have Esther beg with the king and plead with him for her people. Well, now for the first time, one of these masters of intrigue who would have a far-reaching reputation to everybody who's reading Esther in the original audience, they'd be like, oh, dang, you just gave a very important morsel of information to someone whose entire job is to trade in very important morsels of information. Now 3 people in the story know that Esther is Jewish. Well, we've seen already that Esther has been very good at winning the sympathy of the eunuchs who are in charge of the harem, the eunuchs who serve her and work with her. Well, really, everybody serves the king, but you know what I mean. Here, we've got to look back on those previous incidents and be like, well, she won their favor before. We're going to assume that she still has it and that this Hathach fellow is going to have her back and know what to do with that information. Now, Mordecai is setting up a push here to get Esther to take the big risk and heed the call to adventure and not do the comfortable thing, but do the dangerous thing with a very high ceiling in terms of positive returns. And Mordecai, I think, knew that she was going to balk at this a little bit. So his plan to persuade her to go and approach the king is something that happens in a couple of acts here. And one of them is to initiate the idea that he will tell other people about her Jewishness. So far, he's just hinted at it to this one eunuch who is obviously loyal to Esther. But if Mordecai would tell him, maybe Mordecai would tell some people who are less discreet. So I think Mordecai is tenderly twisting the screws, but he's twisting the screws, and he's trading on the reputation of eunuchs to do so. Again, to us, that term conjures something totally different than what it would have conjured for the original audience. And I can tell already this is probably going to be a 2-day conversation, but c'est la vie. Let's stay after it. A eunuch, point blank, is a castrated male set aside, consecrated, if you will, for service in a royal palace in the ancient world. We know for sure that the Assyrians employed eunuchs in this way. Herodotus tells us that the Ethiopians employed eunuchs way, way back in the ancient world. And we get confirmation in the New Testament book of Acts that that practice was still going on in Ethiopia when Philip has his famous interaction with the Ethiopian eunuch who ends up getting baptized. Further, we know that the Ethiopians every 3rd year sent 5 castrated boys to the Persians as a tribute. And that might sound horrible to you because it is. But now try to do the mental ethical scaling on this when I tell you that the Babylonians sent 500 castrated boys for service in the Persian court as tribute every single year. Further, we know other groups had a yearly obligation to send some castrated boys to Persia as well. We also know that the Persians at times, when they would win a foreign war, they would make eunuchs out of some of the boys and then employ them in service around their empire as well. We also know that some of these eunuchs rose to massive levels of prominence. Cyrus had 2 different eunuchs he leaned on very, very heavily, one of whom ultimately ended up being responsible for the transportation of his body after his death and guarding the tomb of Cyrus personally for 12 years after that. Darius employed eunuchs to manage his harem and seems to have had pretty good luck with that. And his son Xerxes continued the tradition. Again, we know from Herodotus and Ctesias, as well as Xenophon, another ancient Greek historian we haven't talked about as much, that the eunuch class during the latter reign of Xerxes, so right where we are in the book of Esther, started to get out of control. Instead of serving its intended function, which is supporting the king and not having ambitions, it grew into something much more ambitious. And then it evolved shortly thereafter into something not just ambitious, but willing to act on those ambitions, with certain powerful eunuchs going on to sow discord and intentionally make chaos among the harem and amongst the wives and descendants, because I remember these kings have sons from multiple different wives and even concubines. And it's pretty easy pickings for a socially sophisticated person who has an eye for power and doesn't have an eye for dynasty because of their inability to have a family to really start messing with things in a ruthless way. So early on in the Persian Empire, the thinking was put eunuchs in these positions. I mean, I think the word literally is derivative of a couple of ancient Greek word parts that mean like bed or bedroom guardian. So we're going to take these people who, because of the alteration we forcibly inflicted on their body, we're going to take them and we're going to put them in these great positions of trust, imagining that the only thing that motivates people is dynasty and improving the fate and the standing of your family. Well, over time, the Persians got a tough lesson in, there are other things that motivated people in the ancient world as well. And they greatly underestimated the eunuchs, especially these terribly corrupt ones, who would eventually play a singular hand in the assassination of at least 3 future Achaemenid emperors, and would play the central role in initiating, I guess, what you could call 2 separate Persian civil wars, dynastic struggles over who would come next. Yeah, we didn't come anywhere close to getting all the way through all the things that we need to talk about to frame this up, but you're smart. You understand the rhythm of what we're doing on this podcast and this season of it with the book of Esther. It's not like Matthew, where the vast majority of the story is just, Jesus is on screen. He's Jesus. So it's easy to just dive deep into his words and his actions and how people responded to it and what his enemies do. Here, we're really trying to dive deep into a much more remote part of history. And anywhere we have the ability to flesh out our understanding of that, no pun intended, we want to do it so that this great age-old story that is intentionally a little bit ambiguous in terms of what the take-homes are and what you're supposed to do with it, we're trying to dig into all of the details we are able to scrape together to try to plumb the depths of this brilliant, inspired work. And I guess sometimes that means we need to take a couple of days to talk about eunuchs, which is what we're doing right now. We'll pick up right where we left off next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
Eunuch episode of the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Come on.